Hello, I'm Debora Field. I'm with Newmark Grubb Zimmer Commercial Real Estate Company. I am a broker. I handle commercial properties for tenants and landlords, and I consult and work on land and retail and industrial and office buildings. I have a history of several years in the Kansas City market, and I am here to answer a few more questions that we didn't get covered last time. So first of all, the first question we have today is, what are the main advantages in buying instead of leasing real estate? Well, first of all, the main reason is having control over your property, having control over your costs and expenses. When you lease real estate, you are subject to the landlord, when your lease expires, raising your rent. And when you have control over the property that you own, then you can determine what your long-term costs are through the mortgage that you have, the purchase price, and the initial phases of identifying the property. Also, when you own property, you could buy a property that's larger than what you need and rent part of it out. So you have potential income from that. It also could provide you with some expansion space if you buy a property that's large enough, if you think you're going to grow. There are good tax advantages to owning property, but you should consult your accountant for advice in that regard. Also, another good reason to own real estate is just the long-term benefit of the real estate investment, because at some point there will be a residual value when you go get along down the road and you want to sell it. So now that doesn't mean that there's a guarantee that there's an upside, but there are statistics that say that over time there's been an increase in property values of 26% over a 10-year period. The reason that you would buy also is that there's some pride of ownership. Real estate's not a liquid asset, so that you may not be able to sell it exactly when you want to sell it, but you will be able to sell it for hopefully some appreciation in value. Our next question is, well, what are the advantages to leasing space? Well, we've covered that you don't get to commit for as long when you lease as when you buy, because when you buy, you have a mortgage. Although you can sell at any time, you probably have a 20 or a 30-year mortgage. When you lease space, you're probably going to do that for 3 years or 5 years or 7. When you get to the point where you're signing a 10-year lease, you probably should consider buying that property rather than leasing the property. You can grow and expand, you can contract, you can right size during the downturn in the economy. And with leasing, you can cap your expenses, or you can identify them more easily, because you can negotiate some of those clauses with your landlord. You can also get into your space for less upfront money when you lease versus when you purchase. When you purchase, you have a down payment, you have closing costs, you have the fit-up costs for the occupancy and your needs in the building you buy. Normally, when you enter into an office building lease, there will be some tenant finish allowance provided, and the landlord will put that into the deal and amortize those costs over the lease. It'll be embedded within that lease rate. If you sign a retail lease or an industrial lease, those costs generally are yours, and so therefore those costs up front may be higher than if you were to purchase a building when you lease. The other issue with leasing is that someone else manages the building. Unless you have a triple net lease and you are in charge of everything from landscaping to snow removal, paying the taxes, and maintaining the facility. However, in a full service office lease, you'll find yourself not really having to pay any attention to that. Someone else does all those for you, and the operation of the building, the cost would be passed through to you if it increases from year to year. So those are kind of the summary points for buying versus leasing. People always ask me, what are the most important terms that should be addressed in a lease? I know there are basic facts that go into, or basic issues that are addressed in a contract. But the question is, what gets ignored and what lacks definition? In other words, what are the most common lease dispute issues between a landlord and a tenant? Well, I have a list of about 30 issues that are business oriented that should be in a lease. But landlords and tenants don't adequately address the functional aspects of how a property operates. The most important things to put detail with in your lease are the functional things like who pays for utilities, how are they paid, how are they determined, what happens if they increase over time, and the snow removal, the landscaping costs, what happens if there's repair requirements. Well, those things need to be addressed in detail in the lease, and you consult a good attorney to cover those items. However, do not let those items become just legal points. They have to be considered by your business, with your business in mind. The other thing that I'd like to address is what are the ways for our tenant to build flexibility into a lease? Well, when you're first new in your business, you can't really see the future. And so therefore you want as short a term as you can get. However, if you want the landlord to provide tenant finish so that with new carpet or paint or new walls and doors, that landlord really has a right to be paid back over time for the investment they make. And that investment might be, in fact, not just tenant finish, but a real estate commission and any other costs, legal fees, soft costs, engineering, or whatever that they might have. So the length of the lease will be determined somewhat by how much you expect that landlord to pay for the improvements they provide. So it is a balancing act to some degree. If you really have to have a short-term lease because you can project that you're going to grow, then you'll have to find space that will allow you to get in at very little cost. The other thing that you might want to consider with a flexibility point is a termination clause. If you can negotiate with a landlord, if that landlord will allow a termination clause, they may require you to pay rent for a certain period of time. And then a right may kick in, and that right may be something you exercise with a written notice to the landlord with the payment of the unamortized costs of the transaction. Sometimes that termination clause can be at one given time, or sometimes it can be any time after a certain period that you've paid rent. That termination clause will be very expensive. Most of the time, in my experience, tenants feel they need them and they don't exercise them. They find that they've leased the space, time flies, and they're happy. So they don't exercise those. One more question about flexibility we can cover today is the subleasing. Subleasing is flexibility of last resort, in my opinion. And a good sublease clause is something that your attorney should cover for you. Be sure your attorney reviews the sublease rights because they can be very, very detail oriented. Subleasing is difficult because as a tenant you have to hire an agent, you have to pay above market fee, you don't know when that tenant that's going to be suitable comes along to take you out of your obligation. You have to get permission from the landlord for a tenant. They have to be suitable to occupy the building. And finally, you're still financially obligated. So subleasing, although is the last resort kind of flexibility item in a lease, you still want that in case you have to be put in that position.